Coming up on the Sky News Daily, the toppling of a dictator. But who is Bashar al Assad, and in what state has he left Syria? All you need to know, coming up. Bashar al Assad's 24-year dictatorship of Syria is at an end. Those, the screams of joy of just a handful of the tens of thousands of prisoners he'd put behind bars, now enjoying their first taste of freedom. Like his father before him, Assad had been a brutal leader. With the help of Iran and Russia, he'd managed to keep control of most of the country during a 12-year civil war. Yet there had been hope for a time that this softly spoken eye doctor might make a break from the barbarism. Here he is talking to Sky News back in 2009.
Do you see a time when you could be hosting another young president, Barack Obama, in Syria?
Any summit between any two presidents is something positive. That doesn't mean we have to agree about everything, but when we discuss, this is how we can close the gap.
In the end, it took barely a week to see Assad fall and for he and his family to claim asylum in Russia. Professor Michael Clarke is our defence analyst. Michael, let's go back to the very beginning. Bashar al-Assad was never meant to be president of Syria, was he?
No, he was in London studying ophthalmic surgery. His girlfriend was a student at King's College, and his brother died. And so he called back to Syria to become the heir apparent to Hafez Assad, his father. And his father was regarded as a tough autocrat, not a very nice man, but he brought a certain amount of secular stability to Syria at a time in the 1980s and 1990s when political Islam was on the rise. It was a pretty rough autocracy. A lot of people were imprisoned. It wasn't as cruel as his son has proved to be.
How long have the Assads been in charge of Syria then?
Oh, well, 50 years now. Back to the 1970s.
So when, on the death of his father, Bashar al-Assad took power, which was when? That was
2000. Yeah.
2000. What sort of country was he inheriting at that point?
It was never a great sort of powerhouse. It had a certain amount of oil, but not huge amounts. It had certainly a thriving tourist trade and exports quite a lot of olive oil and some agricultural produce to other parts of the Middle East. But it was a country, 25 million people, not huge, but not small either. And so it was a viable country, and a lot of people I know a lot of the diplomats who were ambassadors in Damascus. They thought it was authentically Arab in the sense that it was interesting. It wasn't specially westernized. It wasn't the happiest country because Hafez al-Assad was such a strong man, but it was a stable country. But all of that, of course, changes with the 9/11 attacks in 2001 and the upsurge of political Islam that then stimulated.
So what did that do to Bashar al-Assad, to his regime? Because for a time, he was viewed perhaps as perhaps he could be a reformer.
Yeah, that's what they thought, that he was a mild-mannered sort of man. He looked like a North London optician.
Yeah.
As opposed to an Arab strongman. But in that year that he took over, between 2000 and 2002, there was a lot of suppression in Damascus itself. And although it didn't extend to the rest of the country, he began to show his hand. He felt he needed to be as tough as his father. And it's often said he wasn't a wicked man. He was just not a very imaginative one. He just agreed again and again to suppressive measures. And he must have known what was going on. The cruelty that was meted out under his regime was astonishing. And in the civil war that began in 2012, 600,000 people have been killed. Of those 600,000, almost 400,000 were civilians, and 90% of those civilians were killed by the Assad government. They'd been murdered by Assad. So this banal, boring man presided over death and torture and murder squads that was pretty unprecedented, even in Middle Eastern history.
Was that the reason then for the uprising developing into full-scale civil war by 2012, or was it that Arab Spring that was taking place across the region?
So it all began in December 2010 in Tunis. Immediately it spread to Syria. And so by April 2011, Assad had a revolt on his hands, and that turned into a civil war when groups in the north and the east began to arm themselves to actually move in on Damascus. And in that civil war, He started to use chemical weapons in 2013. They were used in Ghouta for the first time. There have been more than 200 chemical weapon attacks on the civilians of Syria by the government of Syria. By 2015, Assad was almost being removed. He literally looked as if he was finished. And the Russians moved in and they saved him. And from then onwards, the Russians have invested an enormous amount in trying to keep Assad going, as have the Iranians next door. They've been all over Syria doing all the fighting for the Syrian army, in effect.
What was so attractive to the leadership in the Kremlin, the leadership in Tehran, in Syria? I mean, was it just a fellow traveller in the form of Bashar al Assad?
For the Kremlin, this was a way back into the Middle East. The old Soviet Union had been involved in the Middle East quite extensively in Egypt and Syria in the 1950s and 60s, but had been thrown out. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, then their influence went. This was a way for Putin's Russia to get back into the Middle East. The Iranians got out of it a client state that needed the Iranian support. So the Republican Guard were operating all over Syria. It gave them influence with Hezbollah in Lebanon, gave them influence to attack Israel or to undermine Israel. Iran and Russia, for different reasons, both found it convenient to be involved in Syria. And the more they became involved, the weaker Assad actually became. He was strong in terms of repression, but he had less and less legitimacy with the Syrian people because he wasn't able to do anything. His backers, the Russians and the Iranians, increasingly were calling the shots. There was always this sense that, well, is he going to last? Well, the Russians have saved him. Can they keep on saving him? By about 2018, 2019, people were beginning to say, look, we think this man is appalling and we think what's happening in Syria is terrible. But, he's not an old man. We're going to have to live with it.
And Michael, look, I suppose that the pace of regime change suggests that people just didn't see it coming.
Yes. I mean, I was saying about 10 days ago, when the rebels, HTS, moved from Idlib, where they'd been in charge for a little while, and they just took Aleppo so quickly, I thought that was the writing on the wall, because the Syrian army clearly wasn't going to fight. And I said then, I said that there are three destinations for Assad at the moment. It can be Iran or Russia or swinging from a lamppost in Damascus. He's going to have to choose one of those three. And I didn't think it would be this quick, but I could see once Aleppo went, he was in big trouble.
OK, Michael, so what can you tell us about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, this rebel group, this militia group, that certainly looks like it was instrumental in bringing down Assad?
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, this new created group, they've split with al-Qaeda and tried to remake themselves as a more secular group, or perhaps secular is the wrong word, a nationalist group anyway. And they had talked to Turkey, to Erdogan. I mean, they were getting help from Turkey in running Idlib. I think Erdogan then saw some opportunities, and it took everyone by surprise after Aleppo how quickly they could move southwards. They had 4x4s and Land Cruisers and things like that with machine guns mounted on the back. That was about it. And they had numbers. The point is that when armies collapse, we saw in Afghanistan, we saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Libya, when they collapse in a very similar way. Officers on the front line get frightened, and they take their uniforms off and turn in civilian clothes and jump on a motorbike and go. Once the officers leave, the unit collapses. I mean, why should they fight if the officers go?
And why were they going? Was it just a collapse in morale? Was it that they felt there was an inevitability?
Well, in Aleppo, I think they were undermined as well. I think a lot of the officers were frightened because HTS were clever enough to identify them and talk to them and say, we don't want to kill you, but we're coming. And so just leave your weapons and go. Once the officers go, then the unit collapses. When one unit collapses, collapse happens everywhere. So they did deals with some groups. Some groups changed sides. Some groups put up a little bit of resistance. But essentially, this military advance involved very little fighting.
I'm wondering whether the thing that has changed is the level of Russian support, the level of Iranian support.
Yes. I mean, HTS, they did prepare this. They put a lot of effort into thinking about what they would do and the political messaging of all of this. They calculated rightly that the Russians were preoccupied in Ukraine. They'd taken at least 1,000 personnel home to go to Ukraine. And then, of course, they perceived that with the Gaza war, that Iran was on the back foot and that the Iranian Republican Guard Corps were not in a position to mobilize big numbers in Syria because they were in Lebanon, they were with Hezbollah, and they were disorganized by the effect of the war. So they chose their moment when the two most important backers of Syria, Iran and Russia, had other problems to deal with.
But from a kind of just a general Western perspective, do we just have to sit back and wait until the dust settles? Because it's by no means certain that they, or indeed Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, the leader of the group, will end up in control.
No, it isn't. I mean, we all know it's very volatile. The chances of a pluralistic, still less a democratic Syria emerging from this are pretty small.
These rebels are largely Islamists, aren't they?
They are. Jolani says he believes in a multi-group or multi-ethnic Syria. He believes in being tolerant, but he doesn't believe in democracy. He said that very clearly, because as a political Islamist, democracy is regarded as blasphemy. Political authority in a democracy comes upwards from the people, but it should, in his view, come downwards from God. So political Islam, as a matter of principle, does not believe in democracy. So we're not going to see democracy emerge anytime soon, but we might see some sort of benevolent dictatorship, and we would hope it was a coherent dictatorship. If we sort of extend what HTS were doing in Idlib to the whole of Syria, if they run the whole of Syria the way they ran Idlib, it will be an improvement on Assad, but it certainly won't make it look anything like a Western country. I mean, if HTS are going to be in control for a while, then it makes no sense to leave them as a prescribed terrorist organisation. I mean, the sheer reality is that if they are the government, and if they take the seat at the United Nations that Syria occupies, then you have to recognise that. That won't be easy, but that's just a matter of political reality. I mean, everyone worries that HTS, whatever they say, will turn into a Taliban. And it may be in a year's time they'll look quite like a Taliban government.
But I suppose the outpouring of celebration from the Syrian diaspora, despite the fact that the future of their country remains so unclear, it is something of an indication of the legacy that Bashar al Assad leaves behind him.
Yeah, and I hope for all of their sakes that they get what they want. I hope they get a more free Syria, a Syria that works for its younger people. The economy is shrinking by about 5% a year. There's a huge amount of inflation. The country is doing almost nothing economically. As always, I mean, there are so many poor people in Syria, and the one person who's not poor is Assad and his group, who were living the high life.
Well, this is what I was going to say. I mean, let's finish very specifically on him and the embarrassment. There must be embarrassment for a dictator like him getting on a plane and begging for asylum, political asylum in Russia.
Yes. So the family a few days ago began to flee. He seems to have left last, and he said nothing since the beginning of this crisis. He's never appeared in public, never made a statement, but like all great dictators, he just cowers away until the moment comes to disappear.
Michael, thank you. We will be returning to Syria throughout the week as our teams on the ground get to grips with what's happening. Until then, head to skynews.com for the very latest. We'll see you again tomorrow.